Well, welcome back to Truth Be Told. Today we're diving into one of the most provocative and polarizing conversations in science. My guest today is Harvard astrophysicist Avi Loeb, a titan in the field of cosmology with over 1,000 published papers and the brains behind the Galileo Project, which is focused on searching for extraterrestrial technological artifacts. But Avi isn't just chasing traditional questions. He's challenged the very boundaries of scientific consensus. In 2018, he argued that the Oumuamua, the first known interstellar object to zoom through our solar system, might actually be an alien technology propelled by radiation pressure. And most recently, he claimed that fragments recovered from a 2014 meteor may contain components pointing to an extraterrestrial origin, a claim that ignited fiery debate among his peers. Today, we're going to explore what motivates Avi to dive into controversial claims. How does he respond to critics accusing him of centralization? And the search for intelligent alien life can or should be part of our mainstream science. Well, I'm Tony Sweet with Truth Be Told. Please welcome to the Truth Be Told studios for the first time, Avi Loeb. Hello, hello.
Thanks for having me.
Well, like I said before, I have to say it 2 times. Thank you for doing this, and it's an honor to have you on the show. So,
my pleasure.
You know, I'm just a country boy from Kansas, so, you know, I never went to...
Yeah, I'm also a country boy. I don't see myself any different.
Okay, there we go.
I mean, the only thing that distinguishes me from people I meet very often is that I'm still curious. You know, I don't want to assume that the answers exist. I want to figure them out.
Yeah, and that's why the name of my show, Truth Be Told. I'm always looking for the truth. I hear one person, I said, that's wonderful. Now let's hear somebody else and tell me their theory. So it's, you know, you never know.
It's called the second opinion.
That's right.
But for me, the most important opinion is that of nature. In other words, it's a learning experience, and we should just collect as much evidence as possible. You know, for me, the greatest pleasure I can have is having as much data as possible, to be flooded with data, because at that point, you know, nobody can shove the anomalies that we see under the carpet of conventional thinking. And, you know, that's what happened to the church 350 years after Galileo died. They realized that Galileo was correct and they admitted that, because it would have looked foolish for them to deny the data that we have by now. The Earth is not at the center of the universe. Now, we still believe that we are unique and special, and even though we see other houses on the street that look just like ours, you know, Earth-Sun systems, we still believe that they don't have residents. It's an extraordinary claim to imagine something like us. And I just say, you know, we're probably not the pinnacle of creation. Just look at the news every day. And we should search for them. It's, just saying, are we alone is not enough. That's what you tell lonely people. You tell them you have to go to dating sites. You need to seek your partner. You can't just imagine the partner will show up next to you. That's too presumptuous.
I love that. Well, according to my mother, when she was, God rest her soul, but I was unique and special, so...
You know, that's what we all think at a young age, because, you know, just like with AI systems, our training data set is very limited. So when you are just seeing your immediate environment, you think that you are, you know, at the top of the food chain. Once you expand it, and I'm sure once we realize what exists around other stars, we will realize that we are definitely not at the top of the food chain, cosmologically speaking.
I totally agree with you, and I know people aren't here to hear me talk about my mother thinks how she thinks I'm special or not, but I do want to start. I do want to start with the main one that most people know you for is the Galileo Project. I want to dive right in because, you know, the project was aiming to, you know, identify potential extraterrestrial technologies and using specific scientific framework. So specific types of data and phenomena would definitely suggest there's a non-human origin. And how do you discuss them from human-made or versus natural anomalies? Because
Yeah, I mean,
that's a big.
yeah, it's relatively straightforward. If we find a gadget that either is functional and it behaves in ways that we cannot reproduce with human-made technologies, obviously that would be an important sign. If it's not functional, if it's just debris that we find, relics, something that collided with Earth and is not working anymore, we can still tell if it's technological, if it definitely doesn't look like a rock, and we can still examine the composition of it and figure out that it has the isotopes with abundances that are outside the boundaries of solar system materials. That there are many ways to tell that something didn't arrive from this Earth, that based on the material composition, it's very difficult to change isotopes because chemistry you can affect by heating materials and so forth. To change isotopic composition, you really need to produce some nuclear reactions, and that's not easy, and that's a barrier that doesn't happen very often in nature. And so if we find a spacecraft that is not functional, we can easily tell that it came from outside the solar system. And and if we see something behaving in ways that are outside the envelopes of the flight characteristics of human-made spacecraft or craft in the atmosphere, we will know. And that's what the Galileo project is trying to do. We built one observatory that collects data on about 1 million objects per year. And then we're putting together 2 additional observatories actually this summer. And the other feature that they will have is they will have multiple units within them that look at the same object in the sky from different directions. So we will figure out distances and velocities and accelerations of objects. And that way we will be able to tell by the end of the summer if we see among the hundreds of thousands of new objects that we will see during the summer, whether any of them is not natural. Definitely we can differentiate birds from technological objects. And among the technological objects, if we see anything behaving in ways that human-made technologies cannot reproduce, we will know that we found something exciting. Now, the U.S. government admitted, in multiple reports from the Director of National Intelligence to the U.S. Congress that there are objects they cannot identify. And my point is, this is a matter of national security. It's a serious matter. Scientists cannot just dismiss it,
right?
Because it's a threat to the nation if there are adversarial nations that are operating devices in the sky over the U.S. And there was a Chinese spy balloon that was spotted and shut down, but we want to understand everything. So at the very least, by doing this work, we can help the Department of Defense do its job. They can use our sensors, they can use our AI software that we develop. But if we find anything extraterrestrial, that would be the icing on the cake. And whoever finds it will get the Nobel Prize.
With the amount of, and people think 1 million objects a year. Well, it's like saying I have $1 versus Elon Musk's, 400 and whatever billion trillion dollars. So it's a lot. It sounds a lot to us, but there's so many objects that are out in space. It's really just very insignificant, but
exactly, most of the objects we can already say that at most a few % of the objects can be outliers. Most of them we identify. So we use artificial intelligence and we train our models on data, and as we get more data, they will get better, and we will be able to find 1 in 1 million, 1 in 10 million objects.
Wow!
If it's extraterrestrial. In that sense, we're going in an uncharted territory. There was never a study of this nature. The Galileo Project is also seeking materials from interstellar meteors. These are objects that came from outside the solar system and collided with Earth, and we're looking for what they're made of, whether they were rocks or maybe technological gadgets like a Voyager spacecraft that, in 1 billion years will reach the opposite side of the Milky Way galaxy and could collide with a planet like the Earth. So we are open-minded, and obviously there would be rocks, but among them they might be some technological devices. And I should say, on January 2nd, 2025, this year, there was an object that came close to Earth and was classified as a near-Earth asteroid. And then it was realized this object actually moves along the orbit of the Tesla Roadster car that Elon Musk launched. And it just shows that, the astronomers can get it wrong. And speaking about that, I was motivated initially by the discovery of Oumuamua, which was an object the size of a football field, the first one identified by astronomers from outside the solar system. And I said, well, it looks like it has no cometary tail. We didn't detect any gas or dust around it. But nevertheless, the object was pushed away from the sun by some mysterious force without showing the rocket effect from evaporation. So the question is, what was pushing it? And it had a very extreme shape, most likely flat, like a pancake, based on the variation in reflected sunlight as it was tumbling every 8 hours. So I suggested it's being pushed by reflecting sunlight. And so, my colleagues, experts on comets, were saying, no, it is a comet, but you can't see the cometary tail is invisible, which is just like, the claim made by the adults in the room when a kid said the emperor has no clothes, and the adults said, oh, the clothes are invisible,
Yeah.
So the explanation to Oumuamua from the mainstream came in various flavors. They said, maybe it's a hydrogen iceberg and you can't see the cometary tail, or it's a nitrogen iceberg, or it's a dust bunny. And most recently, just half a year ago, there was a paper with all the comets experts claiming that Oumuamua belongs to a class of objects that were just found near Earth, and they call them dark comets. What do they mean by that? They mean that they have some non-gravitational acceleration to them, but we don't see a cometary tail, and therefore they must be dark comets where the tail is dark. And Oumuamua might have been just like that, except they're pushed much less than Oumuamua. The acceleration is much smaller. Oumuamua had to lose about 10% of its mass to get boosted by as much as we saw it moving. So they claim dark comets are a new class of comets where you don't see the tail. And I was looking at their objects, and half of them not only came close to Earth, but also came close to Venus.
Really?
And then I remember that the Russians, the Soviet Union, back in the 60s, they were really obsessed with Venus, and they launched a lot of spacecraft, some of which were lost, some of which stopped functioning, they could not communicate with weeks before they arrived at Venus. And so it looked like, at the very least, one of the orbits looked exactly like Venera 2. So this was called the Venera program in the Soviet Union. And I said that it could be that these dark comets belong to this Venera program of the Soviet Union. These are not dark comets, but they're actually spacecraft. And my suggestion was immediately contradicted by two papers that appeared immediately after mine, because they saw it online and they said, no, it's not that. It cannot be that, because the trajectory of the dark comet is slightly different from the trajectory of the Venera 2 spacecraft. And their papers got accepted for publication immediately, and my paper was blocked. It was not. I was not allowed to publish. Yes, by the editors, because they said, look, there are these papers, and they show that there are small differences in the orbits. So they published criticism of my work without publishing the work on which the criticism, is talking, discussing. And so just yesterday, I see a new paper that came out by an independent scientist that I've never interacted with, and he shows that actually it could well be that 6 of the dark comets are Venera spacecraft, because there is a constant of motion that you get, and they cluster around the values of the Venera objects. And I basically argue that the small differences in the orbits may be just because the Venera spacecraft came close to Venus and they got a kick, gravitational kick that is inevitable, that made the orbit a little different. At any event, this is another illustration how the mainstream of comet experts will argue that everything in the sky is comets, even if you don't see the cometary tail, which, is the signature of a comet. I mean, it's an oxymoron to talk about dark comets. You're saying, it's just like talking about a zebra without stripes. And right. You say that's a stripeless zebra. And,
it's a horse.
It's a contradiction of terms.
Well, let me ask you this, because when you're talking about the skeptics, is this more rooted in science or just institutional discomfort with like a paradigm shift?
Yeah, it's called the cognitive dissonance in psychology. Yeah. When someone comes along and suggests something that is news to you, then you tend to get not only dismiss it, but get upset because it shakes your belief. The other thing is, these experts are very attached to their ego. And when I say it's something else, they feel as if it would imply that they miss the point. And they get stature and prestige out of claiming that they are the experts. How would they look like if they missed the point?
Oh, yeah.
Now, all of these, Venera spacecraft, they obviously were produced by humans. We know that. Mm-hmm. And the fact that the astronomers were misled by arguing that they are dark comets, now they made actually my point that Oumuamua would have been technological. It came from outside the solar system. The question is who manufactured it. They went ahead just trying to argue that there is a class of natural objects, comets that are dark. Now, if we find that they are Venera spacecraft, they actually made my point that dark comets are actually spacecraft, and therefore Oumuamua might have been one. And so it's interesting. It's an interesting anecdote, and I wonder what they will say in response. I'm actually discussing the details of the analysis of these dark comets with the person who wrote the paper from yesterday, and we are actually getting very interesting results now.
Well, if you could go back or looking back, is there anything that maybe you would have framed differently to engage with more traditional scientists in this debate, or would you have just plowed forward and done the same?
See, my role as a scientist is to attend to the evidence and leave all possibilities on the table, and then seek additional evidence that will clear the case. Okay. I'm not a therapist. So if people have a cognitive dissonance and they get upset, I'm not really seeking approval from them.
I love that.
And I don't care how many likes they have. And of course, what happens as a result is that they get upset. They say, they attack me even personally sometimes, and they try to block my papers. But it really doesn't matter. It doesn't hurt me. I don't care about it, because nature is whatever it is. Just think about the fact that the Earth moved around the sun for 4.54 billion years, right? And then the church came along in the last 2025 years or so, and claimed, that the church claimed, the Vatican in particular claimed that the Earth is at the center of the universe, and the sun moves around the Earth. Okay, so did the Earth change its orbit as a result? I mean, it was doing it for 4.5 billion years. Who cares what the church was saying? The Earth continued to move around the sun the same way it did before. What. And who cares about the last 2 millennia? So humans can say wrong things. My papers might not be accepted, but who cares? I'm just trying to tell my colleagues what sounds reasonable. If they dismiss it, I mean, Galileo suffered much more. He was put in house arrest. Nobody is chaining me. So I say what I think is right. And, whether it turns out that these dark comets are Venera spacecraft will eventually become clear. Like this scientist came along and wrote an independent paper, even though my papers were blocked. I wrote to the editor of the journal and said, look, you are completely biased. I didn't get a reply.
I was going to say.
but there was a good reason why this editor was biased, because, there are mobs of, critics come together and act like a mob. And it's sort of like, in a sense, it's what you find in kindergartens, where if there is a kid that is different from the rest of the kids, then a group of kids, tries to make fun of the kid. And, this is not a very noble response to scientific research, but that's, I wouldn't argue that. I would actually make the case that many of the scientists that I know are anti-science because they have an opinion and they don't want the facts to speak for themselves. So they are arguing that there is no need to collect additional evidence. When there are anomalies, they shove them under the carpet, and then they claim to the world, there is nothing new. There is no anomaly. And then you ask yourself, how come there were no discoveries recently? And the answer is because there were anomalies, but they were ignored or resisted. Right. And anyone that tried to say that there are anomalies was bullied. So when you have a culture of this nature, innovation is suppressed. Mm-hmm. And I really don't care about what they say. I care about reality. Now, for example, think about the possibility that we have a neighbor, that there are aliens out there. Whether we accept it or not, whether people in academia say that it's an extraordinary claim and there is no evidence and we should not fund it, there should not be any federal funding to the search for technological signatures, and they put all their funding, more than $10 billion, and I'm not speaking hypothetically, this is reality, more than $10 billion in the next 20 years will be allocated to the search for microbes, okay, with zero allocation of funds to the search for technological signatures. That will not change any fact that we might have a neighbor. The neighbor will not disappear just because the astronomers want to spend $10 billion on searching for microbes.
Right.
So my point is, it doesn't really matter whether my papers get published, whether money is spent on what I'm talking about, because reality is whatever it is. And eventually we will find out. But it's just a pity if we are not doing, pursuing the scientific truth efficiently, because we're wasting our time on insisting on opinions rather than checking whether they are correct or not. So my point is, we should hedge our bets. We should search for microbes. That's perfectly legitimate. That's appropriate because microbes might be very abundant. But at the same time, we should at least spend 10% of our funds or research time on the search for technological signatures. And that means $1 billion. Okay, so you spend $10 billion on searching for microbes, spend $1 billion on objects near Earth that might have arrived from an extraterrestrial civilization, or search for city lights on the dark side, the night side of exoplanets, or search for industrial pollution in the atmospheres of exoplanets. I think these are worthwhile targets for scientific investigation as much as searching for microbes.
Then I'm going to bring that up because you just said, city lights or pollution. Has there been any discoveries at all that were very close to wait a minute, this could be something here? Was there ever a planet that you said this actually could have some type of life form on?
Well, the reason I mentioned these two signatures is because I wrote a paper about them a decade ago. And so far, I should say the response was, oh, it's interesting, but we will keep searching for something else.
Right.
If we look at the chemical fingerprints in the atmospheres of planets, we will search for oxygen, methane, and other signatures of primitive forms of life. Okay? This was the response, rather than saying, okay, well, let's put into the inventory of possible chemicals that we are looking for. Let's put also CFCs that are produced by refrigerating systems, and they polluted the atmosphere of the Earth. I calculated that if there is another planet like the Earth with 10 times the pollution that we produce, or 100 times, the Webb telescope should have been able to detect such a signature. So it's worth, of course, pursuing this, but if nobody is seeking the evidence, we will never find it, and that's the situation. But that's not new, you know.
Right.
In 1952, Otto Struve, an astronomer, argued that one can look for Jupiters close to their host star as they block the light from the star when they move around it, or if they tag the star back and forth. We could detect that if they're close to the star. And people, I mean, nobody allocated observing time to the search, because the astronomers in the mainstream were quite confident that Jupiter can never form close to a star. We understand why it forms so far from the sun. And therefore, the signature would be much more difficult to detect at such a separation. So nobody was searching until in 1995, a hot Jupiter was discovered by chance by two astronomers, and they got the Nobel Prize for it. And when I checked their paper, the discovery paper, it did not reference Otto Struve. So, 40 some years after he suggested it, the discovery was made, but it was not made because people listened to him. And you find this many times in science. It's a sign of inefficiency, because the mainstream is not allowing people to deviate from the beaten path. They are either ridiculed, or resources are not given to them, telescope time or funds. And of course, you will not discover that you are wrong if you're not checking. If you don't deviate from the beaten path, you will never realize there is another path. And in fact, that path is far more interesting. And so, that's what I'm trying to change in the culture. And I should say there are lots of young people who joined the Galileo Project and are very excited to work on it. For example, someone came to my home and wrote a check for 3 summer fellowships for undergraduate students. Just a month ago, I advertised the fellowships, and within a day I got 5 students from Harvard College who were very excited and enthusiastic about helping the Galileo Project. So, of course, this bias doesn't exist among young people that are not so attached to their ego, that are not entrenched in their expertise.
Right.
But I'm trying to mentor them so that those young people, so that they will not become the adults we all know.
Have you worked with some of these students that I remember watching a movie? It was a Kevin Costner movie called Hidden Figures, and it was these African American women that, of course, in those days were completely kind of shunned. Just do your job, don't talk, just do the numbers. But have you worked with students that have recreated a path where you thought that's made you kind of rethink some of your...
Oh, definitely. Even
great.
My first student, who is now faculty at Harvard, taught me new things that I didn't know when I first started working with him. So definitely, and I don't think that talent is correlated with where you grow up.
No.
With anything to do with ethnicity, nothing. But I do think that it's really important, because people that are not well educated early on, they need to catch up, okay? But if you give them a chance, they will do very often much better than people that are good on paper.
Yeah.
However, merit and excellence should be the goal, okay? So one of the mistakes often made is that it's virtue signaling, just showing, I have people of various types around me.
Right.
That by itself should not be the goal. The goal should be promoting excellence and allowing people from all possible backgrounds to join the group, as long as they're doing an amazing job, And I should say that there are many such people who came from unprivileged backgrounds, myself included. I grew up on a farm. And that's why I adopt this approach.
I love that, and I'm glad you said that. It should be all about who deserves and the excellence that can help change this world for the better, or even just giving a better understanding of what that is. And one thing that you bring up a lot, and I love it, because truth be told, we're all about paranormal, UFOs, all this stuff. You say spacecraft. In most of our layman's terms, it's a object where there's little aliens inside flying across the universe, going through the galaxies. What do you mean by spacecraft when it comes to this big? The people that are listening is the object that you discovered. So please tell us what spacecraft means to you.
Right. So when I say technological objects, I mean either space trash. We produced a lot of objects in space that are not working anymore, like the Venera spacecraft that I mentioned. But it could also be a functional device. And the more interesting ones are functional devices. By the way, the reason I'm interested in intelligence in outer space is because we can learn from it. And I don't often find it here on Earth. That's the other reason. But the question of what we will encounter if we have functional devices, you see, even now, the battlefield, both in Ukraine and in the Middle East, is now shifting towards drones rather than piloted airplanes.
Right, yep.
And that tells you something, so we always had this imagination of, seeing little green men or women in a spacecraft. But if we look towards our technological future, it's very likely that there will be things we send to space that have an artificial brain. Because of artificial intelligence, we can allow that gadget to think for itself. In fact, the human will not help much. It will make it more vulnerable, because the human body is vulnerable, and you can harden the hardware that you build. So if I were to extrapolate 100 years from now, 1,000 years, 1,000,000 years, I can imagine us shifting towards space exploration by intelligent spacecraft, intelligent devices that are completely autonomous, because travel across large distances requires a lot of patience. They will be patient, and requires, because of the long journey, survival, longevity, and you can provide that to a technological gadget. So if we get visited by a more advanced technological civilization, I would expect gadgets with an artificial brain, artificial intelligence, more than biological objects, entities. But I could be surprised, and these would be the functional devices. The devices that are space trash would be a mixed bag, because it depends what most of the space trash was to start with. And it could be that most of the trash represents early stages in the technological evolution of a civilization, and therefore it would not be very advanced technology. It would be just pieces of junk. But we could still tell that it's not rock,
Right.
And so Oumuamua, for example, because it was flat and because it was pushed by radiation pressure from the sun, it could have been just the surface layer of a bigger object, technological object, or it could have been a broken piece from a mega structure like a Dyson sphere. That Freeman Dyson imagined that advanced civilizations will harvest the entire the light coming from their host star by surrounding it with a big structure, and those structures would not live forever. They would be eventually destroyed by the evolution of the star that will become brighter and break them apart. So maybe Oumuamua is a broken piece of a Dyson sphere, or maybe some other technological object. But we don't know, because we didn't collect enough data. And the good news is that actually within a week, we will start getting data from the Rubin Observatory in Chile that was funded by the National Science Foundation and Department of Energy in the US. And it will employ a camera with 3.2 gigapixels that will
That's gonna
survey
be cool.
the southern sky every 4 days. And give us a lot of data on objects that come close to Earth. And my hope is that we will find many more objects like Oumuamua, and then, we can study them in great detail with the Webb telescope as well, not just ground-based telescopes.
Right. Well, we're talking a lot about space, which this is amazing. I love it. But a recent article that I saw that you made everybody start stirring a little bit was the expedition from the Pacific floor. Can you go into a little bit more details what that is all about? And walk us through that constitutes this interstellar origin, because it's fascinating. That's what really caught my eye. So please.
Yeah. So as it turns out, in 2014, on January 8th, U.S. government satellites spotted a meteor, an object that was roughly 0.5 meter in size, that collided with Earth, and they recorded a very high speed for this object. And together with my student, we discovered that this object actually had such a high speed that it must have originated from outside the solar system. It could not have been bound by gravity to the sun.
Wow.
And at first, our paper once again was blocked. So this seems to be a repeating theme in my overview. The paper was blocked from publication because
Here we go again.
The reviewer was saying, I don't believe the US government data. And so I reached out. At the time, I was chairing the board on physics and astronomy of the National Academies. And through the White House, I reached out to the US Space Command. And after a few years, they issued a formal letter to NASA that says, we looked back at the data, and indeed, this object came from outside the solar system at the 99.999% confidence. So the paper was accepted for publication, and at that point I decided to lead an expedition to search for the materials in the wreckage of this meteor. And we were funded at $1.5 million and went on a ship called the Silver Star. We had a Netflix documentary filming crew with us, and the film will come out.
I can't wait.
In early 2026. At any event, we used the magnetic sled covered with magnets that we placed on the ocean floor, and we went back and forth 26 times across a region that was about 10 kilometers in size. And the ocean depth was 2 kilometers at that location. And then we collected the materials and found these molten droplets, meteoritic droplets, that I brought back to Harvard University and gave them to my colleague, Stein Jacobson, who is a world-renowned geochemist that analyzed them in his laboratory with his team. And we found that about 10% of those molten droplets had a composition that is different from solar system materials.
Wow.
With very enhanced abundance of beryllium, lanthanum, uranium, up to 1,000 times more than in the materials that made the solar system. And now what we are doing is trying to study some isotopes. And as I mentioned before, that's a very good way of telling if the material came from outside the solar system. And hopefully in the coming months, we will have some results on that.
If it is proven to be outside of our solar system, or even, artificial, how would this change the course of your research or the Galileo Project focus?
Well, first of all, it would be the first time that humans put their hands on materials from a large object that came from outside the solar system.
Wow.
And now the question of whether it was naturally produced or artificial can be answered only if we find bigger pieces, because the droplets that we found were molten. They do not represent the original material.
Wow.
So we are hoping to go again with a robot, a remotely operated vehicle that will provide us with a video feed so that we can collect bigger pieces and This expedition will cost $6.5 million. And so we are hoping to get a person who will fund it, and we have everything else ready. And if we did find, a gadget in that location that is not a rock, of course, that would have huge implications for the way we perceive our place in the universe, our future aspirations in space. It will have implications for religion, for a lot of things, politics. But we first have to find something like that. And, it's obviously there would be a lot of rocks that we might find first before we get to an artificial gadget.
I'm actually looking forward to seeing the results, and I'm sure you're going to publish those as soon as you find them, or at least when you get the chance. But our time is running fast, and I wish I had another hour with you, but I think I'll have to have you back for another time. But I do want to end on this. You have some amazing books, and many of them suggest a natural progression from alien life to humanity's own future beyond Earth. Do you see spacefaring civilizations as a necessity for our survival, or just a curiosity should we explore regardless, no matter what?
Oh no, I think it's really important for our future survival, because we can learn lessons from
other planets.
There must be Darwinian selection associated with extraterrestrial intelligence. The fittest survives, and the question is, what are the tricks that allow them to survive? And we want to learn that so that we will not be destroyed by an incoming asteroid or some other catastrophe, self-inflicted wounds or whatever. And the best way to learn is from someone smarter than us. And so I hope that we will be open to that possibility, because it would have huge implications. I discuss it, as you mentioned, in many of my essays that I publish on medium.com, and I invite anyone listening to subscribe for free. There is no cost. Avi Loeb at medium.com, where you can find a lot of those discussions.
Well, I love it. And Avi, thank you so much. You are just blow my mind, and I love how you tell us in terms that we can understand. So a lot of times it just goes right over our head, and I appreciate you. The old saying is dumbing it down.
It's simply because I explain only what I understand, and also I don't regard myself as different from any other person. I'm just willing to stay curious. That's the main difference, I would argue.
Well, thank you so much. Well, I appreciate you. And everybody, thank you for tuning in. And please go to Avi-Loeb, Loeb.medium.com, and you can check out articles and all kinds of different things that Avi has published, and just, I'm sure, other things that are coming up soon. But thank you again for tuning in every Friday right here at 3 o'clock on Truth Be Told on the Club Paranormal channel on YouTube. So until next time, take care of yourself and each other. We'll talk to you soon. Bye.